I just wanted to start by saying thank you everybody for joining. This is obviously a very timely issue. So I wanted to sort of get out there and try to promote some information about trade policies that are we've been seeing for the last few months, what might what might be new trade policies to come, and given sort of where I'm at, to think about the impacts of those changes on California agriculture. And so that's why I sort of had the idea to sort of put together this public-facing webinar. If you didn't hear, there should be a Q&A, so I'll be monitoring the Q&A as we go, and will try to do my best to answer those questions as I receive them, but if not, I will leave them to the end of the webinar, and if there's so many, I might actually just push them to sort of an upcoming webinar and talk more about the questions that I've received as part of this webinar. So just to give you an introduction about myself, so my name is James or Jay Sayre. I am an agricultural economist, and in particular, I'm a University of California Cooperative Extension specialist, or assistant professor of cooperative extension, however you want to call it, based in the UC Davis Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics. And my focus in my job is to think a lot about the economics of food supply chains in California, and particularly to think about what might be policies that are going to impact them. And so trade obviously is sort of one of the most pressing issues at this moment. A little bit about myself: I obtained my PhD in agricultural economics in UC Berkeley, where I specialize in agriculture and international trade, just to give you a sense of some of my qualifications. So I just want to preface this with a disclaimer. The opinions that I'm going to express in this webinar are mine, and they don't reflect the opinions of my employers. So just keep that in mind. So just to give you a sense of what I'm going to talk about today. So in the first bit, some of you may already be quite familiar with California's agricultural landscape and international trade, but I think it's worth pausing and talking a little bit about some of the features of California's agricultural trade landscape, which I think really are important to reflect on the importance for changes in trade policies today and what's coming around the corner. The second, I'm going to talk a little bit about how California and Mexico are both really, Mexico we've seen really a sharp surge in imports in agriculture from Mexico over the last 2 decades. Many of those commodities compete directly with California's agricultural products. But also we've seen deep integration of agricultural supply chains between the US and Mexico, but in particular, California and Mexico. So I have some data that I want to present. And then, of course, what everyone's here for is what's going on with trade policy right now and how it's going to impact California's agricultural sector. And then finally, I'll leave a question and answer. So just to sort of give an overall summary of California agriculture and international trade, California is the largest agricultural producer in the US. And by some metrics, it's the largest, it's definitely the largest agricultural producer. And by some metrics, it's the largest agricultural importer in the US, because we're the largest state in terms of population. And so we're consuming the most agriculture. California is going to be the second most export-oriented state as a share of all farm sales in the US, and many commodities in California are sold more than 50% abroad. And then export exposure is going to vary greatly by county, where you're going to think that counties that are going to be in our Central Valley, which is comprised by both the Sacramento and the San Joaquin valleys, are going to be the main exporting regions. And I'll show some statistics on that. So the first, in case you're not familiar, and many of course, of the participants on this call are very familiar, here's just a sense of the top 10 agricultural commodities that are produced in California. So dairy, grapes, cattle, lettuce, almonds, pistachios, strawberries, and the list goes on from that. And so then if you compare basically what California's largest agricultural products in terms of production are to what are exports, you see a pretty tight linkage between sort of what California is producing in large quantities and then what we're also exporting as well. And so, for instance, if you look at, say, things like almonds are our top exports, dairy, pistachios, wine, and walnuts, you see that there's pretty large export values in terms of sales for many of those commodities. And so if you take, for instance, the total value of exports, which I'm showing here, and then you divide that by the total value of production, then you get a measure for the export share, which is basically how much as a fraction of sales is a given commodity being sold in foreign markets. And so, for instance, you can see here that there's going to be a large amount of sort of variety in which products tend to be sold more in foreign markets versus domestically. And so foreign markets is any market that's outside of the US, and domestically is going to be within the US. And so, for instance, things like almonds, cotton, pistachios, rice are all sold very highly in foreign export markets, and things like avocados tend to be sold much more domestically. And so just to give you a sense, in a hypothetical world where California producers were not able to access export markets, taking almonds as an example, US consumers would have to increase their consumption of almonds 5 times in order to sort of match what would be lost by sort of the removal of sort of foreign markets as destinations for those almonds, which I'm sure almond producers would appreciate, but that's just to give you a sense of the magnitudes for how large exports are for some of the commodities produced in California. And so just to give you a sense of summary statistics for where to put California in the US's agricultural landscape, California is the largest agricultural producer. So here I'm just ranking the top 5 agricultural producers. And so California has an agricultural production that's valued at about $60 billion, of which 24 billion are sort of is the sort of value of our agricultural exports. And so just dividing exports by total production, you get that about 41% of California's farm sales are sold into foreign export markets. And so that puts California as having the second highest export share, and that's only going to be behind Hawaii, although Hawaii has a much lower total value of both production and exports. And so really, you can think that California, especially among top agricultural producers, is going to be much more oriented towards exports than other states. And so just to sort of take stock of where these California agricultural export products are sort of exported to, the top markets are sort of not entirely surprising. We have Canada, the European Union, China, Japan, and Mexico, and then you can keep going down the list. And so those are going to be really important countries to think back on as we're thinking about current trade policies, and just to keep in mind of if policies that say Canada is going to retaliate against California and the US's agricultural products, then we should keep that in mind when we're thinking about the impact of retaliatory policies on California's exports to say, our largest trading partner, which is going to be Canada. And so if you then, what we can do is we can compute the share of overall farm sales that are sold in each county in California to export markets. And so there's a little bit of, we don't know exactly how much each county is selling, but if you just weight each the acreage planted in each county by sort of the crops that it's growing, and then you multiply that by the amount of sales in each commodity that California sells in foreign markets, then you can say roughly how export oriented each county is in California to export markets, or what is the total share of sales that each county has in foreign markets. And so this ranges from about 5% to 60%. So that would be the dark green on this map. And again, you can see that counties that are going to be in California's Central Valley are going to be much more export oriented than the rest of the state. So when we're going to think about regional impacts for which producers, which workers are most dependent on foreign markets as a total of farm sales, really you should think that that's going to be a lot of the areas in the Central Valley. So next, I want to talk about the sort of intertwined relationship and sort of growing import dependence on Mexico that we've been seeing over the last couple of decades. And so in particular here, we can plot US trade patterns in fruits and vegetables. And so US exports of fruits and vegetables have increased since the 1990s. This graph makes it a little bit harder to see. But really what we've seen a really strong surge in is US imports of fruits and vegetables, where now we run a pretty substantial trade deficit. That is to say, we import more than we export of fruits and vegetables. And so every year that deficit has increased. And about half of this is due to increasing imports in fruits and vegetables from Mexico. And so one of the big reasons for this, and I'm going to keep talking about these acronyms, so it's important to sort of spell them out over time, is because of NAFTA, which is now called USMCA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, and now which is called the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And so since NAFTA, most tariffs on agricultural trade between the US, Mexico, and Canada have mostly been eliminated. And so that might be sort of true for tariffs, but one of the sort of almost more important factors that's sort of still persisted is these plant health or phytosanitary barriers that persist for certain goods. So think avocados and then dairy still have lingering phytosanitary barriers. And for those commodities, those barriers are actually likely in many cases more important than sort of tariffs were, at least historically. And so as a result of NAFTA sort of eliminating tariffs and giving some certainty to importers that they would continue to have largely duty-free imports from Mexico for the foreseeable future, now many agricultural supply chains are quite interconnected between California and Mexico. And so as I alluded to earlier, NAFTA in 2020 became the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which is negotiated during the first Trump administration and ratified in 2020. And so NAFTA, the USMCA agreement is mostly a continuation of NAFTA in that it maintains duty-free trade for most Mexican agricultural exports to the US. And to qualify, the only sort of new feature of USMCA is that the goods must meet sort of what I would consider increased agricultural labor standards. It's not necessary that every agricultural import that the US imports from Mexico is subject to USMCA. So if a producer doesn't necessarily want to do the paperwork or sort of engage in these sort of higher agricultural labor standards, they can do so and continue to export to the United States. However, they won't be subject to potentially reduced duty rates under USMCA, which is a continuation of NAFTA. The sort of important part to say is up until the last month, generally speaking, even if you sort of weren't doing the paperwork to qualify for USMCA, the sort of most favored nation tariff rate, which is the tariff rate that everyone else, as long as you're an ally of the United States, you would pay, was generally pretty low as well. And so up until about a month ago, there wasn't for many goods that had sort of low MFN rates, there wasn't a big incentive to sort of fulfill these labor standards, do the paperwork to sort of qualify for USMCA because there just wasn't much of sort of a cost to doing so. And so now in 2023, as a result of sort of continued market access for Mexican exporters to the US, Mexico is going to supply 63% of US vegetable imports and 47% of US fruit and nut imports. So Mexico has accounted for about half those trends that I showed previously in the US's trade deficit in fruits and vegetables. And so if you examine individual commodities, you can really see a large increase in Mexican imports in recent decades. And many of the goods that Mexico produces are also goods and crops that California is going to produce as well. So if you're interested, my colleague Ali Hill and I, who's at UC Berkeley, have put together an online dashboard where you can visualize both trends in agricultural production of sort of whatever crop you want to select, as well as annual exports from Mexico to the US of these crops. And unsurprisingly, you see that, say, as production of tomatoes has increased in Mexico, exports from Mexico to the US of tomatoes have also increased. And so one of the reasons that a lot of people have suggested for why we've seen such an expansion of imports from Mexico in these fruits and vegetables is really pretty stark and large wage gaps between what an agricultural laborer can earn in the US and what they can earn in Mexico. So again, my colleague Ali Hill and I sort of dove into both US and Mexican agricultural censuses and produced some trends for sort of what, as an hourly wage, what a worker in say, California might earn compared to a worker in Michoacan, which is a state in Mexico. And so what we found is on average, Mexican workers earn about 8 to 10 times less in Mexico than they would for equivalent work in the US. And of course, that's a pretty stark wage gap. So certainly, Mexican farm labor employers are paying a lot less in terms of wages as a percentage of revenues across a variety of crops, and most notably in fruits and nuts. And so we sort of wrote about that in a sort of 2024 issue of the ARE update, if you're interested in checking that out. However, of course, it's sort of incomplete story to only sort of compare labor wages. There's obviously many more both differences in costs of production between Mexico and the US or California, but also sort of just pure productivities. And so what we can also do is we can compare yields, which are measured here. They're measured in sort of the international standard, which is metric tons per hectare. And you can see across a number of commodities, from apples to blueberries to oranges to lemons, many of which are things like avocados and lemons. Thinking about US production is basically only occurring in California. You see that yields in the US are far higher for most commodities than in Mexico. And so thinking only about the labor point of the question sort of ignores that in general, we see lower yields across agricultural production in lots of Mexico, which again, it sort of suggests that you want to think about both the cost of the inputs, but also the productivity of the farms, and take into account that US farms in general are much more productive. And of course, one factor that's not worth sort of pausing upon is how, despite that we've had a lot of imports coming from Mexico and in fruits and vegetables over the last few decades, they're not always uniformly distributed in terms of seasonality. And so here I'm plotting the seasonality of monthly strawberry, both imports and then domestic production. And so you can see that California generally produces strawberries mostly in the summer, with sort of a little bit of a lull in the winter. And so you can see that in the winter, when California is producing relatively fewer strawberries, that's when producers in Florida and then Mexico are sort of filling those sort of seasonal lows. But from a Californian perspective, you see competition with Mexico in say May and June, but a lot less in July, September, and to a smaller degree October. And so one of the ways in which Mexico's imports have increased is that they're filling in some cases for when say California producers are not producing in a given season. That's true for strawberries. The sort of picture is a little bit mixed, depending on or sort of more solidly on the import competition side for things like avocados, where you see there's still strong seasonality in California's avocado production. Again, most harvesting is going to happen between April to September, but you see much more competition with Mexico throughout the whole growing period. And so depends on the commodity, but in some cases, Mexico is sort of counterbalanced some of the seasonality, so consumers can consume strawberries year round. In other cases, Mexico has competed more directly with California producers, and you really have to do that analysis on a crop by crop basis. And so if anyone's interested in sort of some of those plots, we've posted them online at this sort of website. And so as a result of having in many crops sort of competing seasonality, although less so in, say, avocados, many sort of importers and processors in California are sort of well integrated between the US and Mexico. So they might source production from California in the summer and then shift over to Mexico in the winter. And so I've assembled some data on who are the identities of firms that are importing from Mexico in the US. And so of those with location information, we see that around 28% are located in California. But amongst those, Californian importers source, in terms of value, about 44% of those commodities, and elsewhere in the US, about 56%. And so that really suggests that Californian importers are playing a large role in sort of sourcing a lot of this produce that's coming from Mexico. But to give a sense of sort of that integration that I alluded to earlier, you can see, and here I'm plotting basically the share of imports that's attributable to a firm that's headquartered in California. And you can see in commodities like strawberries, spinach, and avocados that many of those imports are being imported by firms that are sort of located in California, many of which also are going to source their sort of their sort of integrated grower importer operations where they might grow in California in the summer and then import from Mexico in the winter. So you see that is very high for things like strawberry, spinach, and avocados, and then for coffee, where you have to have processing in sort of throughout the US. Coffee is generally when you have coffee roasting that's going to happen throughout the US. You see that Californian firms have a much smaller share in those imports. I think there is a question, but I'm not sure if I can see it. If you could write, if you have a question, if you could write it in the question and answer so I could see it, that would be great. Otherwise, I'm not sure how to see it. In any case, I'll if you want to ask the question, I'll sort of allow you to ask questions, sort of and turn your video on at the end. Otherwise, if you have a short question, if you want to write it in the question and answer, that would be great. And if I don't see it in the question and answer, I'm just going to keep moving on. Okay, so now sort of apologies for sort of setting the context. I want to jump into sort of what obviously most people are here for, which is thinking about what's happening with trade policy right now, especially as it relates to California agriculture. So the real answer is that as measured by economists who are sort of putting together these measures, we've seen really, really high levels of trade policy uncertainty that sort of, as you can see here, are sort of almost setting sort of historical limits for trade policy uncertainty. And so other economists have found that, obviously we'll talk about tariffs and how tariffs are going to impact both sort of exporters and importers. But even if we're not thinking about, what the tariff rate is on a given import, we're in a situation with very, very elevated trade policy uncertainty. And the challenge is for supply chains, that's going to make forward-looking investments really, really hard to think about at this time. And so I won't have an answer for sort of what trade policies sort of might come, because the answer is that within a period of a lot of uncertainty, it's going to be really hard to sort of say what the tariff rate might be in a month, 2 months, or 3 months. And so I think that really makes it challenging for even if firms want to sort of move production back to the US, they might ask themselves whether or not these tariffs will persist. And so, whether or not, if say a firm wanted to bring back production to the US, they might be asking themselves whether or not these tariffs will continue for 2 months, 3 months, or however long they might happen for. And so economists have looked at the effects of just this sort of uncertainty alone, and they found that it will increase consumer prices on goods that you sort of go to the supermarket and go look at. But it also sort of reduces the products that might be available to consumers, say in the grocery store or on product shelves. And so just this uncertainty alone will have impacts, according to these economists, on prices and then sort of what consumers have available to them. And so that's sort of what I would say focuses as sort of the most sort of impactful factor just off the bat. So the next is taking stock, and so sort of where tariffs are now. This is sort of a graph that shows roughly the sort of average tariff that we have on each of our trading partners, as weighted by the share of the value of imports that we're importing from a given country. So China is obviously the highest. China's the country we've been having the largest sort of proposed tariffs on, which have sort of gone up and then gone down. But you can see that now really we have pretty substantial tariffs in place on many of our trading partners. And if you sort of were to go pre-2025, in many cases, these rates would be less than 1 or 2%. So this really represents sort of a pretty high escalation of tariff rates vis-a-vis sort of pre the second iteration of the Trump administration. So just a brief review of tariff actions. On February 1st, President Trump issues an executive order to impose 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and 10% tariffs on China. Those are paused for about a month. And then on March 1st, those tariffs are sort of back on. But the Trump administration sort of then declared that goods that were covered under the US-Mexico-Canada agreement to be tariff-free. And so I'll come back to that because that's going to be quite important for the agricultural sector. And then sort of on April 2nd, there's these sort of so-called reciprocal tariffs announced, which were then paused again 9 days later, except for broad-based 10% tariffs on all countries other than Canada, Mexico, and China. And then China had its own sort of round of tariffs and escalation. So it started with a 34% tariff that was then increased to 125%, and then now it's back to 34%. And depending on the type of product we're talking about, those may or may not be stacked with other tariff actions that this administration put in place, or tariffs that sort of applied to Chinese goods earlier. And so the question, and I'll focus first on the import side, and then I'll talk a little bit about the rates that our agricultural exporters are going to face. But first, just to talk about imports and sort of impacts on say consumers. First, I wanted to summarize what rate sort of our agricultural imports might be subject to. And so the easy answer is that until July 9th and the Trump administration announces what they're going to do going forward, it's about 10%, unless it comes from Canada, China, or Mexico, or the product is specifically exempted. And so we've seen pretty large increases in exemptions for individual goods. So it's hard for me to talk about whether or not an individual product is exempted, but we've seen pretty pretty striking increases in firms and importers asking for product specific exemptions. So those are sort of done on a case by case basis. So what about Canada and Mexico? So many agricultural goods are exempt under USMCA, but those that are not exempt are subject to a 25% tariff. Again, there's exemptions on that, which makes examining this a bit more challenging. But in general, if you're not subject to, if you're not importing goods under USMCA, those goods are going to be subject to a 25% tariff. So I'll talk about what proportion of our imports that are coming from Canada and Mexico are going to be exempt. But it's worth mentioning that this is not just sort of imports of produce that are going to be consumed by American consumers. Farms also or farm producers also can be importers as well of things like live animals, so cattle, and particularly there's challenges with sort of screwworm of sort of cattle imports right now. Nursery plants, and then also farm equipment like things like tractors. And so if your tractor is made with sort of imported steel, or even if it isn't, those prices can also increase. So just wanted to mention that sort of imports, farms also import as well as consumers. So just to give a sense of Mexico and sort of total food, sort of agricultural and food imports, and what percentage of Mexico's agricultural and food imports into the U.S. are either sort of eligible or non-eligible for USMCA. And so you should think that pre-2020, all of this was sort of whether or not it was NAFTA eligible, and then afterwards it's whether or not it's eligible for USMCA, but it's more or less the same thing. And here I'm going to look at basically everything from fresh produce to meat to fish to even sort of more processed products like chocolate or tequila, beer, alcohols like that. And so what we can see is that sort of, a little bit more than a third of Mexico's imports are sort of non-eligible under USMCA. Of course, this is all based on sort of 2024 data and earlier. And so in that period, there sort of wasn't potentially for a lot of these goods that were sort of non-eligible, there might not have been a large incentive for them to sort of do the paperwork to file under USMCA. So just that sort of baseline, this suggests how much sort of was eligible and non-eligible in the pre-period. We can ask the same question for Canada, and you see a roughly same result. About a third of Canadian imports were sort of non-eligible prior to 2025. And of course, that sort of, we've seen increases in imports from both Mexico and Canada in the last 10 years. So we don't have a ton of data yet on how sort of the tariffs announced in March through April are impacting whether or not importers are then filing their goods as either eligible under USMCA or not. But we have some preliminary data that goes from January through March of 2025. And so what we can do is we can just compare imports from January to March in 2025 of imports from during the same period, that is to say January through March, of all of the prior years. And interestingly, it doesn't seem to be, we actually have so far seen a decrease in imports from Mexico of MCA eligible goods, and actually an increase in non-eligible goods. So this is somewhat surprising. Perhaps, of course, that was only for some period of March that we knew that this was happening. And in general, some of those rules were sort of had a little bit of postponements. So we'll see as the data starts to come in for April and May. The sort of next data release will be sometime around June 6th or so. So we'll see that data as it starts coming in, but we really haven't seen like drastic shifts towards all goods sort of claiming USMCA eligibility. But we have seen a decrease overall relative to a trend of imports from Mexico during this period. Likewise, we've seen sort of a little bit of a slowdown relative to a trend of Canadian imports during the first 3 months of 2025 as well. And so whether or not a product was eligible depended a lot based on product. So generally, some of the products that were not USMCA compliant prior to 2025 were things like cocoa, coffee, vanilla, lots of fish and seafood and shellfish, fruits. So raspberries, blueberries generally weren't USMCA compliant. Lots of tequila, mezcal, beer was not USMCA compliant. And then prepared foods like biscuits and horses. And I forgot to put this here, but this is thinking about Mexican imports, not Canadian ones. But many commodities had almost universal compliance with USMCA in the pre-period. So things like avocados, everyone's favorite import to talk about, limes, strawberries, tomatoes, cow meat, live cattle, and then cane sugar all generally had near complete USMCA compliance. And so when we're thinking about which products might sort of have tariff increases, we're going to think about products that are generally non-compliant in the pre-period, although obviously we need to wait and see the data come in to see which products are able to sort of reclassify themselves in the coming months. And so this is important to think about sort of if we want to ask sort of what products might we see the largest price increases just from the impacts of tariffs that we've seen so far, we really need to think about what's the origin of each of these sort of fruits and vegetables that we're consuming. And so here I'm looking at the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service Market News Movement reports. And those sort of report the source of sort of all U.S. imports of fruits and vegetables. And they also report domestic estimates as well too, although they're sort of somewhat underscaled, so I have to revise them by USDA Census of Agricultural Production estimates. So sort of keep in mind that these are sort of rescaled for California and the rest of the US, so they might not be 100% accurate as they are for imports. But generally, US shares of fruit and fresh fruit and vegetables, Mexico is the largest single source, although obviously if you combine California with the rest of the US, that is sort of domestic production is the largest single source of fresh vegetable and fruit consumption. But Mexico is the second at 26.6%. California is really a huge powerhouse in fruits and vegetables. It's larger than the rest of the US by about 6 percentage points. Then the rest of the US at 17% as a share of fresh vegetable and fruit consumption. Then other countries, and then we have Canada at about 6%, and China at about 2%. So if we're thinking about products that are going to be subject to tariffs, they're going to be basically any country that sort of is categorized as other, like say Peru, Colombia, and so those are going to be hit with 10% tariffs. And then China is going to be hit by whatever tariff rate it's now at, 34%. And then whatever share of products that are coming from Mexico and Canada that are sort of not eligible under USMCA. So in particular, if we think about what products come in from China, that's things like garlic, tropical fruits, and dates. And then if we think about imports that come from countries other than Canada and Mexico, pineapples account, sort of other countries account for about 95% of availability of US consumption. Bananas, 90%, kiwis, peas, and pomegranates. So those, I think, are the products most likely to face impacts from tariffs and passing on to consumer prices. And so, of course, the big question mark here is how US and then particularly Californian exporters will get hit by trade retaliation. And so far, we haven't seen a lot, fortunately. And so really, the only major countries to retaliate against US import tariffs with sort of tariffs on their own imports from the US are Canada and China, both of which have their lists online. The EU sort of had sort of threatened retaliatory tariffs, but right now it's sort of they're paused. But I want to mention that sort of retaliation is not just formal. And so, there are anecdotes of Canadian consumers boycotting US products, sticking flags on where the products came from in the grocery store. So retaliation can mean potentially more than just the impacts of sort of a retaliatory tariff themselves. And of course, it's worth mentioning those because Canada and China are the first and third largest ag export markets for California. And so Canada's taking actions against a wide variety of goods, some of which I put up here. And China is also taking action against a number of goods that are highly produced in California, which I've also listed here. And so within my department, other agricultural economists have estimated the potential cost of an ongoing trade war for California agriculture. And so in the scenario that I think is sort of most sort of similar to what we might potentially see, these authors sort of propose a scenario where the US imposes 60% import tariffs on Chinese goods, and then 10% tariffs that are imposed on the rest of the world, which I think it's not quite what is happening right now, but it's pretty close. And they sort of assume that the rest of the world will retaliate with 10% export tariffs on US exports, and China will sort of correspondingly put a 60% tariff on US exports to China. So I want to mention this is a bit of a sort of, given what we see right now, where most countries haven't retaliated, this would be sort of an extreme example. Most countries have not proposed 10% tariffs on sort of their own imports of US agricultural products, fortunately. But this is just to give you a sense of if they did. So these authors so these authors include Colin Carter, who's an emeritus professor within the Department of Agricultural Resource Economics here at UC Davis, and Sandra Steinbeck and Yassine Yildirim at North Dakota State. So they find that total California export losses in that scenario total $6 billion. So when you think that total California agricultural exports in 2022 were about 24 billion, that's about a fourth of total exports. And so, many commodities, sort of those commodities that with the highest export shares lose the most. So pistachios, almonds, wine, and beef. And accordingly, because as I showed earlier, Californian counties in the Central Valley and our Central Valley are the most exposed to trade. Correspondingly, those counties suffer the largest export losses as well. And so if you're interested in this sort of scenario in this article that these authors put together, the sort of citation here is below. You can feel free to check out the area update that they put together. So that's just sort of on the tariff front, but I think there's a sort of a larger element that, people have talked a lot about tariffs, but I think almost correspondingly, sort of, almost as large of a challenge for a lot of Californian agricultural exporters and US agricultural exporters writ large now is challenges that I see coming around the corner in global shipping. And so right now, partly due to sort of changes in trade policy, but also due to sort of some policies that I'll talk a little bit later, the global shipping sector is facing some challenges at this moment. And so in particular, sort of a decline in imports, particularly from China, is decreasing a lot of cargo shipments coming to the US. And so on May 5th, the Port of LA reported a 44% drop in docked vessels. And that's a challenge because as those vessels come in, they're sort of then available or not for sort of American exporters to ship their goods outbound on those same ships. And we've seen challenges, say, in 2020 and 2021, where there was such sort of so many goods coming into ports that they almost found it sort of not worthwhile to sort of linger and take sort of agricultural, but just in general American exports abroad. And so really, we want to be thinking about whether or not there's continued availability as we were in 2020 and 2021, of cargo ships available to take sort of our exports that we're sending abroad. And so I see some challenges looming that I wanted to mention. So the first thing is that the sort of median American agricultural export, and so this is thinking across crops, more than 86% of its value is exported via sea. So you should really think that in terms of agricultural exports, most of our exports are being transported via sea. So it's very rare to find any product that's exported less than 75% in terms of volume via sea. So there's some counterexamples, but by and large, think that the vast majority of American agricultural exports are traveling on cargo ships and crossing the sea. And so just to sort of put this in a graph, most exports in terms of value are traveling by sea. Some are traveling by road, particularly to sort of Mexico and Canada, and then a much smaller share, less than 5%, travel via air. But when we look at sort of overall expenditures on these modes, sort of how much it costs, how much American agricultural exporters are paying for shipping of each of their exports, despite sea being a large share and air being a relatively small share, American agricultural exporters spend almost 20% of transit expenditures on air. So if we saw challenges in the sea shipping sector, of course, there's other margins, there's other transport modes that people could theoretically export their goods using. But given how expensive air is, that's really going to be pretty cost prohibitive and reflects the fact that air is just so expensive compared to transporting goods by sea. Correspondingly, rail as a share of weight is also pretty is very cost effective as well. And so it's going to be very challenging to ship agricultural exports, which tend to be lower value compared to, say, manufacturing goods, on cargo ships compared to sort of air. So one of the challenges, in addition to sort of these sort of slowdowns in sort of cargo volumes that we see coming into U.S. ports, is a Section 301 review of Chinese-built ships. And so this is a sort of action that was proposed and initiated under the Biden administration and is now sort of coming into full force during the second round of the Trump administration. So this is going to propose fees on vessel owners and operators out of China based on net tonnage per U.S. voyage. And then it will also impose fees on Chinese-built ships. So you should think, it's been reported roughly that this will be a $1 million fee, something in that range, but it could be more. This is just sort of an estimate on Chinese cargo ships docking at U.S. U.S. ports, excuse me. And so, for instance, this was proposed because if you just look at where sort of the total share of all seafaring vessels were built in the last decade or so, or a little bit more than a decade, by country, China has really dominated the shipbuilding sector. It's pretty difficult to sort of see to miss that China's produced more than 40% of all sort of cargo ships that are operating currently, with Korea and Japan also having fairly large shares in the shipbuilding sector. So one, it's going to be really hard to not to sort of avoid shipping your products on a cargo ship built in China just because of just how dominant they've been over the last decade or so. And so if we look at, so this is just where the ships are built, but sort of another restriction of that order suggests imposing fees on where ships are flagged, sort of where the carriers are operating out of. And so I've plotted here the top 10 vessel countries for California agricultural exports, and Californian exports are traveling abroad on sort of Panamanian flagged vessels flagged in the Marshall Islands, but China is the sort of third largest. And so if American exporters now need to sort of indirectly pay these fees on either Chinese flagged or built vessels, given the large share that China plays in both flagged vessels and in total container ships or cargo ships that were built, it's going to either be hard to sort of substitute away to sort of non-Chinese flagged or built vessels, or to sort of course, pay those fees if your cargo is traveling abroad on those vessels. And so I really think that that is sort of going to be a change that's really going to increase the cost that American exporters are going to pay. And so as a result, if we just look, so there's this paper here that looks at the average freight rate that, say, US exports pay in terms of per tonnage or per pound. And they really find that US exports pay overall a much lower rate than US imports. And one of the reasons is because of how many manufacturing, because of our sort of trade deficit in goods, we're sort of importing more than we're exporting. And so supply and demand in global shipping means that many times American agricultural exports are going to pay a lower freight rate to export than imports are going to pay to come into the US. And so anything that's going to increase the cost of US exports is going to decrease their competitiveness. And so that's why this might be important. So just to sort of sum up, there's a few things that I see sort of coming around the curve. One is that the Trump administration wants to sort of renegotiate USMCA at the end of this year, a little bit early before it was supposed to be renegotiated in 2026. So I've been sort of, obviously that hasn't happened yet, but we'll see what happens in those negotiations. The next is particularly in tomatoes. Anti-dumping tariffs that were postponed for a long time are set to resume on Mexican tomatoes. So starting in July, those Mexican tomatoes will have to pay a 21% tariff. The other one that's particularly impactful is that, as in the first Trump administration, there are proposed tariff relief programs called market facilitation program payments that have been proposed to compensate farmers for losses due to trade. And so they're being proposed right now. But the challenge is, if you look at the geographic distribution and based on sort of where those, what commodities were targeted, a lot of those payments ended up not going on a per capita basis to California, but rather to states in the Midwest. And so in general, my colleagues find that for certain commodities, producers were undercompensated in things like nuts and dairy, and other producers were overcompensated in things like cotton and rice. And so the question is, when we look at, for instance, how much sort of USDA direct financial assistance is given to producers, whether or not California will be undercompensated again in sort of the next potential round of market facilitation payment programs. Market facilitation program payments. And so you can just look and see which states receive generally the most direct financial assistance from the USDA. As a share of total production, California is way low on that chart compared to, say, Texas, North Dakota, Iowa, Kansas, and Minnesota. And so and a lot of which is sort of these payments are sort of a lot of these payments sort of not only were for trade assistance, but were also for things like the federal crop insurance program. But sort of these market facilitation program payments were pretty large. They accounted for almost 2/5 of federal crop insurance program payments. And the question it will be whether or not California farmers will be similarly undercompensated this time. And my suspicion is that they will be similar to the first case, although obviously this is sort of an active policy that's being proposed. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions. Of course, if I don't have time to answer all of them, then I'm more than happy, and my intention is to sort of have this be an ongoing series, and we'll aim to sort of answer them in the next one. But thank you all for sort of attending.